The photograph of Kazynet surfaced quietly, discovered in a forgotten envelope lodged at the back of a metal drawer in a provincial archive in Novosibirsk. It had no label, no accompanying report, and no indication of who had taken it. All that remained was the frozen frame of a remote settlement at the edge of the Siberian taiga, 4 wooden houses lined against an endless sea of conifer trees and a single railway track slicing through the landscape like a scar. The image bore the unmistakable grain of late Soviet film stock, and yet its silence felt heavier than the age of the paper. It was as if the photograph had swallowed the sound of that night, preserving only the cold. Kazynet itself was hardly a village, more an accidental gathering of structures built to service the small, rarely used supply line that connected a series of logging outposts further north. Few maps ever noted it, and those that did spelled it differently each time. By 1989, only 6 or 7 residents remained. There was no school, no clinic, not even a shop. The train that passed through each night was the only guarantee that Kazynet existed at all. For most, it was nothing more than a point along a timetable. For the conductors who worked that stretch of track, it was a quiet and predictable waypoint in a region defined by vastness and silence. On the night of August 14th, however, the routine ended without warning. The 2 conductors assigned to the run, veteran engineer Dmitry Koltsov and his younger assistant, Pavel Shirov, reported unusually dense fog rolling over the tracks as the train approached the outskirts of Kazynet. Visibility dropped sharply, and the headlamp illuminated little more than a pale corridor of mist. Still, they expected nothing out of the ordinary. The rails ahead were always empty at that hour. But then Koltsov noticed something. At first it appeared only as a faint interruption in the beam, an irregularity lying along the line. He slowed the train out of caution, assuming it might be a fallen tree branch or debris swept from the forest. Yet, as the locomotive crawled forward, both men realized the object was not shaped like anything natural. Shirov later said in an early statement, one that would vanish from official records within months, that the shape sat upright for a moment, as if aware of us. Koltsov, however, insisted it had been motionless from the start. What they agreed on was this: whatever lay ahead did not belong on that track. Koltsov pulled the emergency brake. The train screeched against the steel rails, vibrations rattling through the empty freight cars. When it finally came to a halt, the cabin filled with a thick silence, broken only by the distant creaking of cooling metal. Both men stepped out, lanterns in hand, into the wet August air. The fog swallowed them instantly. Every footstep sounded muffled, as though the forest itself were listening. They approached the object slowly. Shirov's lantern trembled as he lifted it toward the track. The beam revealed only fragments at first. A dark silhouette, a collapsed shape, and something sharply angular jutting upward. Neither man spoke. The cold pressed into their coats, and the breath hanging in front of them felt too loud. Koltsov once described the feeling not as fear, but as a quiet warning, a sense that whatever they were about to see had been placed there with intention. What they found, however, would never be clearly described in any surviving document. Koltsov and Shirov's initial reports vanished. Replacement statements rewritten by regional authorities offered vague references to interference on the track. The official file closed within days. The photograph discovered decades later is the only physical remnant of that night, capturing the village, the track, and the ominous point where the rails disappear into the fog, where, according to the men who were there, the silence of Kazynet finally broke and revealed something it had hidden far too long. The days following the incident brought an unusual flurry of activity to a place that had not seen more than a handful of outsiders in years. Kazynet, typically forgotten by time and bureaucracy alike, found itself at the center of an inquiry that appeared both hurried and restrained. swift enough to assert control, yet cautious enough to avoid revealing its purpose. Regional transport officials arrived first, followed by 2 investigators from the Ministry of Railways. Their questions were repetitive and oddly specific, focused less on what Koltsov and Shirov had seen, and more on the exact sequence of their reactions. It was as if the authorities already knew what had been on the tracks, or at least what they wanted the explanation to be. Koltsov's initial written statement, according to him, was revised before being entered into the official record. Shirov's, meanwhile, was replaced entirely. Neither conductor was permitted to read the amended versions. Both men were instructed not to discuss the event with anyone, including fellow railway workers. The vagueness of the directives unsettled them, particularly Shirov, whose unease grew in the days that followed. He later confided to a colleague that every version of the story he heard retold by officials seemed to drift further from the truth. The photograph discovered decades later shows Kazynet as it appeared around that time, houses leaning slightly from years of frost, telegraph poles tilting toward the horizon, and the single track where the object had been found. But the image, as revealing as it feels, omits the most important details: what the men actually saw, what was removed, and why no trace of it remained the following morning. Rail inspectors claimed the disturbance on the track was nothing more than debris. Yet debris does not generate conflicting testimonies, nor does it require a sealed file and confidential orders. The supposed object was never logged, never weighed, never recorded. The section of rail was inspected, photographed, and inexplicably replaced within 48 hours, despite being structurally sound. Workers involved in the replacement received temporary reassignment and reported being questioned about their observations, though none could recall seeing anything unusual. Their answers were consistent in tone, but not in content. Details shifted subtly depending on whom they spoke to, as if each man had been coached, intentionally or otherwise, to speak vaguely. Researchers who later examined the case discovered discrepancies between weather records and the descriptions provided by officials. The official report claimed clear visibility and normal fog levels for the region that night, yet regional meteorological logs indicated unusually dense fog bands drifting southward from the upper taiga. Moreover, the archived radio transmissions from the train, which should have included Koltsov's call reporting the obstruction, were missing. The gap in the recording begins minutes before the train slowed and ends nearly 15 minutes afterward. Every other train that night had complete, uninterrupted logs. Local residents of Kazynet, few as they were, contributed another troubling layer to the story. Those interviewed years later recalled waking to the distant sound of the train braking, followed by voices carrying through the fog. But what disturbed them most was the chorus of footsteps on gravel. Several sets, they insisted, though only the 2 conductors were officially present. One resident, an elderly woman named Ludmila, claimed she saw lantern light flickering through the mist long after the train had stopped, moving in deliberate patterns, as if a small group were searching for something. When interviewed by researchers in the early 2000s, Shirov provided a fragile recollection of the hours that followed the discovery. He remembered men in long coats walking along the track, their faces obscured by fog and backlit by the train's headlamp. He remembered being asked to step away, to return to the cabin, and to avoid watching. And he remembered, with striking clarity, the silence that followed, the kind of silence that suggests an event has concluded, even if its meaning remains unresolved. But perhaps the most revealing clue emerged from an unexpected place: a faint, almost imperceptible mark on the rail captured in the original photograph. Experts who examined it proposed that something had been dragged or lifted from the track, leaving behind only a subtle distortion in the metal's texture. It was not enough to identify what had been there, but more than enough to suggest that whatever Koltsov and Shirov encountered did not vanish on its own. As the investigation shifted away from public view, the truth began slipping into contradictions and omissions. Every answer revealed another gap, another uncertainty, another detail smoothed over by bureaucratic restraint. And beneath it all, Kazynet remained unchanged, quiet, remote, and carrying the weight of a night the official record refused to acknowledge fully. As the investigation deepened, researchers found themselves sifting through fragments, partial testimonies, fading memories, and bureaucratic shadows left behind by an institution in its final Soviet years. The collapse of the USSR only a few years later meant many departmental archives were abandoned, relocated, or quietly destroyed. What remained of the Kazynet case existed mostly in whispers and inconsistencies, pointing toward a chain of events that no single witness seemed able to recount in full. And yet, taken together, their fragments suggested a truth far more complex than a simple obstruction on a railway track. In 1996, nearly 7 years after the incident, a regional historian named Arkady Mirov contacted one of the former railway inspectors assigned to Kazynet. The inspector, already elderly, agreed to speak only under the condition that his name not be recorded. His recollection was muddled, but one detail stood out clearly. He insisted that the team dispatched to Kazynet in 1989 had not been assembled by the Ministry of Railways. 2 of the men, he claimed, had arrived in an unmarked vehicle and carried identification he had never seen before, laminated passes with serial numbers, but no departmental insignia. Their questions focused not on the track, but on biological risk protocols, a term that struck him as strangely specific for a quiet rural line deep in the taiga. This cryptic comment sent researchers into a new direction. Decades-old medical files from the region hinted at small, state-run facilities scattered across Siberia during the 1970s and 1980s, experimental outposts designed for isolation rather than accessibility. Many had been closed or repurposed, their missions unclear. One such facility, according to a handful of poorly preserved administrative notes, had operated less than 40 kilometers from Kazynet. Its last official mention appeared in a 1986 inventory. Site 342A, operational readiness unclear. No records described what Site 342A actually did, nor who staffed it. The implication was subtle but unsettling. If the object found on the tracks belonged to such a facility, whether a piece of equipment, a container, or something living, the rapid intervention and the subsequent erasure of documentation suddenly made more sense. But without concrete evidence, the theory remained speculative, resting uneasily between conjecture and possibility. In 2003, another piece of the puzzle surfaced when a retired telegrapher from a neighboring station revealed that unusual transmissions had passed through the network the night of the incident. According to her, a burst of coded traffic, rare for that region, emanated from a relay point north of Kazynet shortly after the train braked. She remembered it because it had the tone of urgency, followed by silence. No record of that transmission exists today. The equipment that logged such data was removed during restructuring and later scrapped. But the telegrapher's memory, steady and unwavering, suggested that someone else knew what happened on the tracks that night, long before any official report. The strongest emotional testimony, however, came from a former resident of Kazynet, a man named Oleg Marchenko, who had lived in the village as a child. When interviewed in 2011, he spoke cautiously, as if afraid of revealing too much to the air around him. He remembered the night vividly, not the object or the officials, but the atmosphere that settled over the village afterward. Adults whispered with urgency, children were kept indoors, and unfamiliar men walked between the houses with clipboards and lanterns. Marchenko recalled being told not to approach the track for several days. When he finally returned, he noticed fresh ballast, new rail segments, and a faint metallic odor that lingered in the air despite the cold. He also recalled an argument between two of the visiting men. Though he could not understand everything, one phrase lodged permanently in his memory: "It must not reach the next junction." The meaning of the sentence remained ambiguous, but it implied motion, movement away from the facility or toward the tracks, or perhaps an attempted escape. Whatever it signified, the urgency in the man's voice was unmistakable. Another source, a forestry worker who often traveled near Kazynet, told researchers he saw helicopter lights in the sky a few nights after the incident. Aviation logs for the region list no flights during that window. The worker admitted he had been drinking at the time, yet his description of the lights, low, deliberate, and scanning the terrain, aligned with reports from two other residents who remembered hearing a deep, mechanical hum passing overhead. Taken individually, each testimony offered only a sliver of insight. But together, they painted a picture of a coordinated response that extended far beyond a simple railway obstruction. It became increasingly clear that the object on the track was not considered random and certainly not insignificant. Someone had anticipated its appearance or feared its escape. Someone had moved swiftly to contain it, and someone had worked meticulously to ensure that whatever happened that night in Kazynet would dissolve into the fog just as quickly as it had emerged. Yet the true shape of the mystery remained out of reach, hovering at the edge of these recollections like the silhouette in the photograph, present, undeniable, but still concealed beneath the weight of silence. In the years that followed, the story of Kazynet drifted into obscurity, not because it was forgotten, but because it was never fully known. The fragments that survived told of an event shaped as much by silence as by action. A night when something emerged onto the lonely rails of a Siberian village and was swiftly swept back into the shadows by hands far more prepared than the men who first encountered it. Yet even those efforts could not prevent the truth from leaking through the cracks of memory, testimony, and a single photograph that refused to disappear. The most compelling information came from Koltsov himself. Near the end of his life, in a letter addressed to a distant nephew, he wrote cryptically about a burden that does not age. Though frail and cautious with his words, he hinted at details that had never appeared in any official account. He described the object on the tracks as something that seemed placed, not fallen, and added that the fog that night carried a warmth at its center, as if the air around the object held a temperature different from the surrounding cold. He never clarified what he meant, but the phrasing suggested an unease that had remained with him for decades. Shirov, younger and less guarded, revealed more in an interview conducted during the late 1990s. He spoke of a shape that resembled a form rather than an item, hunched rather than collapsed, and positioned with intentionality. He described the behavior of the officials who arrived later, not frantic, but precise. They knew what they were looking for, he insisted. They were not discovering, they were retrieving. These words became the foundation for the prevailing theory among modern researchers. The incident at Kazynet was not an accident, but an interception. Attention then shifted toward Site 342A, the mysterious facility located north of the village. Although no direct link to Kazynet existed in any surviving documentation, the timing of its closure, the absence of personnel records, and the sanitized nature of its final inventory raised questions that refused to settle. Some speculated that the site handled experimental biological materials. Others believed it focused on behavioral studies conducted under extreme isolation. A few suggested it was part of a classified program involving field testing in remote territories. None of these theories could be proven, yet each fit uncomfortably well with the patterns surrounding the 1989 event. The final revelation came not from an archive, but from the landscape itself. In 2017, a team of independent researchers visited Kazynet to retrace the events of that night. The village had shrunk further. 2 houses remained standing, the rest reclaimed by rot and the relentless crawl of the forest. The railway still cut through the settlement, though it carried trains only a few times a month. As the team walked the length of the track, they discovered a subtle indentation in the earth beyond the railbed, parallel to where the object would have been found. It resembled the mark left by something heavy being lifted or dragged, its shape smoothed by decades of snow and thaw. Nearby, buried beneath layers of soil and roots, they found fragments of metallic casing, rusted, brittle, stamped with partial serial numbers that matched no known Soviet manufacturing catalogue. Chemical residue on the metal suggested exposure to high heat, far beyond what a simple lantern or flare could produce. Although these fragments could not confirm the nature of the object, they provided the first physical evidence that something had been forcibly removed from the track and destroyed or transported away under controlled conditions. The researchers also interviewed one of the last surviving residents of the area, a man living in a makeshift cabin at the forest's edge. His recollection was as fragile as the structures around him, yet he spoke with certainty about the days following the incident. He remembered the discomfort that settled over the village, unfamiliar vehicles, the sudden appearance of uniformed men, and a silence so absolute it felt imposed. When asked what he believed had been found, he paused for a long moment before responding. It was not meant to be on the rails, and it was not meant to remain. With each layer uncovered, the truth of Kazynet became clearer in shape, but no less elusive in detail. The incident represented a collision of isolation, secrecy, and a Soviet system nearing its final collapse, an event too inconvenient to explain and too consequential to ignore. Whatever emerged onto the track that night, it prompted a response orchestrated with remarkable speed and precision, suggesting that the object was part of a wider network of operations now dissolved into history. The aftermath left behind only traces, memories weighed down by fear, rail segments replaced without explanation, documents quietly removed from circulation, and a photograph that captured neither the object nor the men who retrieved it, only the stage upon which an unsettling episode unfolded. In the end, the true identity of what rested on the tracks remains hidden behind the same fog that enveloped Kazynet in 1989. What endures is not the certainty of an answer, but the gravity of a silence meticulously crafted to protect it. The village stands today as it did then, remote, weathered, vigilant, a silent witness to a secret carried off into the dark, leaving behind a question that outlived both the Soviet Union and the men who tried to bury it.